From places to non-places. The presence of the past in a present that supersedes it, but still lays claim to it. It is in this reconciliation that John Starobinski sees the essence of modernity. In a recent article, he points out in this connection that certain authors, indubitably representative of modernity in art, outlined, quote, the possibility of a polyphony in which the virtually infinite interlacing of destinies, actions, thoughts, and reminiscences would rest on a bass line that chimed the hours of the terrestrial day and marked the position that used to be, and could still be, occupied there by ancient ritual. End quote. He quotes the first pages of Joyce's Ulysses, containing the words of the liturgy, In troibo ad altari Dei, the beginning of remembrance of things past, where the cycle of the hours around the Combray bell tower punctuates the rhythm of a vast and solitary bourgeois day, and Claude Simon's Histoire, in which, quote, memories of religious school, the Latin prayer in the morning, grace at midday, the evening angelus, provide landmarks amid the views, the disassembled schemes, the quotations of all sorts that stem from every period of existence, from the imagination and the historical past, proliferating in apparent disorder around a central secret. End quote. These pre-modern figures of continuous temporality, which the modern writer tries to show he has not forgotten, even as he is becoming free of them, are also specific spatial figures from a world which, since the Middle Ages, as Jacques Le Goff has shown, had built itself around its church and bell tower by reconciling a recentered space with a reordered time. Starobinski's article begins significantly with a quotation from the first poem in Baudelaire's Tableau Parisien, where the spectacle of modernity brings together, in a single poetic flight, the workshop with its song and chatter, chimneys and spires, those masts of the city, and the great skies making us dream of eternity. Bass line. The expression Starobinski employs to evoke ancient places and rhythms is significant. Modernity does not obliterate them, but pushes them into the background. They are like gauges indicating the passage and continuation of time. They survive like the words that express them, and will express them in future. Modernity in art preserves all the temporalities of place, the ones that are located in space and in words. Behind the cycle of the hours and the outstanding features of the landscape, what we find are words and languages, the specialized words of the liturgy, of ancient ritual, in contrast to the song and chatter of the workshop, and the words, too, of all who speak the same language, and thus recognize that they belong to the same world. Place is completed through the word, through the elusive exchange of a few passwords between speakers who are conniving in private complicity. Vincent Descombes writes of Proust's Françoise that she defines a rhetorical territory shared with everyone who is capable of following her reasoning, those whose aphorisms, vocabulary, and modes of thought form a cosmology, what the narrator of things past calls the Combray philosophy. If a place can be defined as relational, historical, and concerned with identity, then a space which cannot be defined as relational or historical or concerned with identity will be a non-place. The hypothesis advanced here is that supermodernity produces non-places, meaning spaces which are not themselves anthropological places, and which, unlike Baudelairean modernity, do not integrate the earlier places. Instead, these are listed, classified, promoted to the status of places of memory, and assigned to a circumscribed and specific position. A world where people are born in the clinic and die in hospital, where transit points and temporary abodes are proliferating under luxurious or inhuman conditions. Hotel chains and squats, holiday clubs and refugee camps, shantytowns threatened with demolition or doomed to festering longevity. Where a dense network of means of transport, which are also inhabited spaces, is developing. Where the habitué of supermarkets, slot machines, and credit cards communicates wordlessly, through gestures, with an abstract, unmediated commerce. a world thus surrendered to solitary individuality, to the fleeting, the temporary, and ephemeral, offers the anthropologist, and others, a new object whose unprecedented dimensions might usefully be measured before we start wondering to what sort of gaze it may be amenable. We should add that the same things apply to the non-place as to the place. It never exists in pure form. Places reconstitute themselves in it. Relations are restored and resumed in it. The millennial ruses of the invention of the everyday and the arts of doing, so subtly analyzed by Michel de Certeau, can clear a path there and deploy their strategies. Place and non-place are rather like opposed polarities. The first is never completely erased, the second never totally completed. They are like palimpsests on which the scrambled game of identity and relations is ceaselessly rewritten. But non-places are the real measure of our time, one that could be quantified with the aid of a few conversions between area, volume, and distance, by totaling all the air, rail, and motorway routes, the mobile cabins called means of transport, aircraft, trains, and road vehicles, the airports and railway stations, hotel chains, leisure parks, large retail outlets, and finally the complex skein of cable and wireless networks that mobilize extraterrestrial space for the purposes of a communication so peculiar that it often puts the individual in contact only with another image of himself. The distinction between places and non-places derives from the opposition between place and space. An essential preliminary here is the analysis of the notions of place and space suggested by Michel de Certeau. He himself does not oppose place and space in the way that place is opposed to non-place. Space, for him, is a frequented place, an intersection of moving bodies. It is the pedestrians who transform a street, geometrically defined as a place by town planners, into a space. This parallel between the place as an assembly of elements coexisting in a certain order and the space as animation of these places by the motion of a moving body is backed by several references that define its terms. The first of these references is to Merleau-Ponty, who in his Phénoménologie de la perception draws a distinction between geometric space and anthropological space, in the sense of existential space, the scene of an experience of relations with the world on the part of a being essentially situated in relation to a milieu. The second reference is to words and the act of locution. Quote, "The space could be to the place what the word becomes when it is spoken, grasped in the ambiguity of being accomplished, changed into a term stemming from multiple conventions, uttered as the act of one present, or one time, and modified by the transformations resulting from successive influences." End quote. The third reference, which stems from the second, highlights the narrative as an effort that ceaselessly transforms places into spaces and spaces into places. There follows, naturally, a distinction between doing and seeing, observable in everyday language, which by turns suggests a picture, there is, and organizes movements. You go in, you cross, you turn. Or in map signs, from medieval maps, essentially comprising the outlines of routes and itineraries, to more recent maps from which route describers have disappeared and which display, on the basis of elements of disparate origins, an inventory of geographical knowledge. Lastly, the narrative, and especially the journey narrative, is compatible with the double necessity of doing and seeing. Histories of journeys and actions are punctuated by the mention of the places resulting from them or authorizing them, but is ultimately associated with what Certeau calls delinquency, because it crosses, transgresses, and endorses the privileging of the route over the inventory. A few terminological definitions are needed at this point. Place, as defined here, is not quite the place Certeau opposes to space, in the same way that the geometrical figure is opposed to movement, the unspoken to the spoken word, or the inventory to the route. It is place in the established and symbolized sense, anthropological place. Naturally, this sense has to be put to work. The place has to come to life, and journeys have to be made. and there is nothing to forbid the use of the word space to describe this movement. But that is not what we are saying here. We include in the notion of anthropological place the possibility of the journeys made in it, the discourses uttered in it, and the language characterizing it. And the notion of space, in the way it is used at present to talk about the conquest of outer space, in terms which, for the time being, are more functional than lyrical, or to designate unnamed or hard-to-name places as well as possible, or with the minimum of inaccuracy, in the recent but already stereotyped language of travel, hotel, and leisure institutions, leisure spaces, sports spaces, rather like rendezvous point, seems to apply usefully, through the very fact of its lack of characterization, to the non-symbolized surfaces of the planet. As a result, we might be tempted to contrast the symbolized space of place with the non-symbolized space of non-place, but this would hold us to the existing negative definition of non-places, which Michel de Certeau's analysis of the notion of space may help us to improve upon. The term space is more abstract in itself than the term place, whose usage at least refers to an event which has taken place, a myth said to have taken place, or a history, high places. It is applied in much the same way to an area, a distance between two things or points. A 2-meter space is left between the posts of a fence, or to a temporal expanse, in the space of a week. It is thus eminently abstract, and it is significant that it should be in systematic, if still somewhat differentiated use today, in current speech and in the specific language of various institutions representative of our time. The Grand Larousse Illustré makes a separate case of airspace, which designates that part of the atmosphere in which a state controls the air traffic. Less concrete, however, than its maritime equivalent, terrestrial waters, but also cites other uses which testify to the term's plasticity. In the expression European judicial space, it is clear that the notion of frontier is implied, but that, setting aside this notion of frontier, what is expressed is a whole institutional and normative mass which cannot be localized. The expression advertising space applies either to an area or to a length of time set aside for advertising in the various media. Buying space refers to all the operations carried out by an advertising agency in connection with advertising space. The craze for the word space, applied indiscriminately to auditoriums or meeting rooms, Espace Cardin in Paris, Espace Yves Rocher at La Gacilly, parks or gardens, green space, aircraft seats, Espace 2000, and cars, Renault Espace, expresses not only the themes that haunt the contemporary era, advertising, image, leisure, freedom, travel, but also the abstraction that corrodes and threatens them, as if the consumers of contemporary space were invited, first and foremost, to treat themselves to words. To frequent space, Michel de Certeau writes, is to repeat the gleeful and silent experience of infancy, to be other and go over to the other in a place. The gleeful and silent experience of infancy is that of the first journey, of birth as the primal experience of differentiation, of recognition of the self and as other, repeated later in the experiences of walking as the first use of space, and of the mirror as the first identification with the image of the self. All narrative goes back to infancy. When he uses the expression space narratives, de Certeau means both the narratives that traverse and organize places, every narrative is a journey narrative, and the place that is constituted by the writing of the narrative. Reading is the space produced by frequentation of the place, constituted by a system of signs, a narrative. But the book is written before being read. It passes through different places before becoming one itself. Like the journey, the narrative that describes it traverses a number of places. This plurality of places, the demands it makes on the powers of observation and description, the impossibility of seeing everything or saying everything, and the resulting feeling of disorientation, but only a temporary one. This is me in front of the Parthenon, you will say later, forgetting that when the photo was taken you were wondering what on earth you were doing there, causes a break or discontinuity between the spectator-traveler and the space of the landscape he is contemplating, or rushing through. This prevents him from perceiving it as a place, from being fully present in it, even though he may try to fill the gap with comprehensive and detailed information out of guidebooks or journey narratives. When Certeau mentions non-place, it is to allude to a sort of negative quality of place, an absence of the place from itself, caused by the name it has been given. Proper names, he tells us, impose on the place an injunction coming from the other, a history. It is certainly true that someone who, in describing a route, states the names appearing along it, does not necessarily know much about the places. But can a name alone be sufficient to produce this erosion or non-place, gouged out of a place by the law of the other? Every itinerary, Certeau says, is in a sense diverted by names which give it meanings or directions that could not have been predicted in advance. And, he adds, these names create non-place in the places. They turn them into passages. We could say conversely that the act of passing gives a particular status to place names, that the fault line resulting from the law of the other and causing a loss of focus is the horizon of every journey, accumulation of places, negation of place, and that the movement that shifts lines and traverses places is, by definition, creative of itineraries, that is, words and non-places. Space, as frequentation of places rather than a place, stems in effect from a double movement. The traveller's movement, of course, but also a parallel movement of the landscapes which he catches only in partial glimpses, a series of snapshots piled hurriedly into his memory and, literally, recomposed in the account he gives of them, the sequencing of slides and the commentary he imposes on his entourage when he returns. Travel, something the ethnologist mistrusts to the point of hatred, constructs a fictional relationship between gaze and landscape. And while we use the word space to describe the frequentation of places, which specifically defines the journey, we should still remember that there are spaces in which the individual feels himself to be a spectator without paying much attention to the spectacle, as if the position of spectator were the essence of the spectacle, as if basically the spectator in the position of a spectator were his own spectacle. A lot of tourism leaflets suggest this deflection, this reversal of the gaze, by offering the would-be traveler advance images of curious or contemplative faces, solitary or in groups, gazing across infinite oceans, scanning ranges of snow-capped mountains or wondrous urban skylines. His own image, in a word, his anticipated image, which speaks only about him, but carries another name, Tahiti, Alpe d'Huez, New York. The traveler's space may thus be the archetype of non-place. To the coexistence of worlds and the combined experience of anthropological place and something which is no longer anthropological place, in substance, Starobinski's definition of modernity, movement adds the particular experience of a form of solitude, and, in the literal sense, of taking up a position, the experience of someone who, confronted with the landscape he ought to contemplate, cannot avoid contemplating, strikes the pose, and derives from his awareness of this attitude a rare and sometimes melancholy pleasure. Thus, it is not surprising that it is among solitary travellers of the last century, not professional travellers or scientists, but travellers on impulse or for unexpected reasons, that we are most likely to find prophetic evocations of spaces in which neither identity, nor relations, nor history really make any sense. Spaces in which solitude is experienced as an overburdening or emptying of individuality, in which only the movement of the fleeting images enables the observer to hypothesize the existence of the past and glimpse the possibility of a future. Even more than Baudelaire, who derives satisfaction from the mere urge to travel, one thinks at this point of Chateaubriand, who travelled incessantly, who knew how to see, but who saw mainly the death of civilizations, the destruction or degradation of once glittering landscapes, the disappointing shards of crumbled monuments. Vanished Sparta, ruined Greece, occupied by an invader wholly ignorant of its ancient splendors, conjured up before the passing traveler a simultaneous image of lost history and life passing by. but it was the journey's movement itself that seduced him and drew him on, a movement whose only end was itself, unless it was the writing that fixed and reiterated its image. Everything is clearly stated from the beginning of the first preface to Itinéraire de Paris à Jérusalem. In it, Chateaubriand denies having made the journey to write about it, but admits that he used it to look for images for Les Martyrs. He has no scientific pretensions. I make no attempt to follow the footsteps of people like Chardin, Tavernier, Chandler, Mungo Park, Humboldt. So that finally this work, for which no purpose is admitted, answers a contradictory desire to speak of nothing but its author, without saying a single thing about him to anyone. Quote, "For the rest, it is the man, much more than the author, who will be seen throughout. I speak eternally about myself, and did so in all confidence, since I had no intention of publishing my memoirs." End quote. The vantage points favored by the visitor and described by the writer are evidently the ones from which a series of remarkable features can be seen. Mount Hymettus to the east, Mount Pentelicus to the north, the Parnes to the northwest. But the contemplation ends, significantly, the moment it turns back on itself, becomes its own object, and seems to dissolve under the vague multitude of similar views from the past and still to come. Quote, "This picture of Attica, the spectacle I was contemplating, had been contemplated by eyes that closed for the last time 2,000 years ago. I too will pass on when my turn comes. Other men, as fleeting as myself, will one day have the same thoughts on the same ruins." End quote. The ideal vantage point, because it combines the effect of movement with distance, is the deck of a ship putting out to sea. A description of the vanishing land is sufficient to evoke the passenger still straining to see it. Soon it is only a shadow, a rumor, a noise. This abolition of place is also the consummation of the journey, the traveller's last pose. Quote, "As we drew away, the columns of Sunium showed more beautifully above the waves. They could be seen perfectly against the azure of the sky because of their extreme whiteness and the balminess of the night. Already we were quite far from the cape, although our ears were still struck by the seething of the waves at the foot of the rock, the murmur of the wind in the junipers, and the song of the crickets, which today alone inhabit the temple ruins. These were the last sounds that I heard in the land of Greece." End quote. Whatever he may claim, I shall perhaps be the last Frenchman to leave my country for travels in the Holy Land with the ideas, the purpose, and the feelings of an ancient pilgrim. Chateaubriand was not on a pilgrimage. The high point at the end of the pilgrimage is, by definition, overloaded with meaning. The meaning people seek there is worth the same to the individual pilgrim today that it always was. The itinerary leading to it, dotted with stages and high spots, comprises with it a one-way place, a space, in the sense employed by Surtout. Alphonse Dupont points out that the sea crossing itself has an initiatory value here. Quote, "Thus, on pilgrimage routes, when a crossing is necessary, there is a discontinuity, and, as it were, a banalization of heroism. Land and water are very unequal in showing people at their best, and above all, sea crossings cause a break imposed by the mysteriousness of water. Behind these apparent facts was hidden another, deeper reality, which seems to have been perceived intuitively by certain early 12th century churchmen, that of the completion, through a sea journey, of a rite of passage." End quote. Chateaubriand's case is another thing entirely. His ultimate destination was not Jerusalem, but Spain, where he planned to join his mistress. The itinéraire is not a confession, though Chateaubriand shows discretion and maintains the pose. And he finds the holy places less than inspiring. Too much has already been written about them. Quote, "Here I experience a difficulty. Should I produce an exact portrait of the holy places? But then I could only repeat what has already been said. Never, perhaps, has there been a subject so little known to modern readers, yet never was any subject more completely exhausted. Should I omit the picture of these holy places? But would not that be to remove the most essential part of my voyage, to deprive it of what is its end and purpose?" End quote. Doubtless, too, the Christian he would like to be cannot celebrate the relentless decline of all things quite so glibly in these places as he does when he gazes across Attica and Sparta. Instead, he resorts to assiduous description, makes a show of erudition, quotes whole pages of travellers or poets like Milton or Tasso. What he is doing here is being evasive, and the abundance of verbiage and documentation really does make it possible to identify Chateaubriand's holy places as a non-place, very similar to the ones outlined in pictures and slogans by our guidebooks and brochures. If we turn for a moment to the definition of modernity as the willed coexistence of two different worlds, Baudelairean modernity, we can see that the experience of non-place as a turning back on the self, a simultaneous distancing from the spectator and the spectacle, is not always absent from it. Starobinsky, commenting on the first poem of the Tableau Parisien, insists that it is the coexistence of two worlds, chimneys alongside spires, that makes the modern town, but that it also locates the particular position of the poet who, broadly speaking, wants to see things from high up and far away, and belongs neither to the universe of religion nor to that of labor. For Starobinsky, this position corresponds to the double aspect of modernity: loss of the subject among the crowd, or inversely absolute power, claimed by the individual consciousness. But it can also be said that the position of the poet in the act of looking is a spectacle in itself. In this Parisian tableau, it is Baudelaire who occupies the central position, the one from which he sees the town, but which another self, at a distance, makes the object of a second sight. Chin on my two hands, from my mansarded eyrie, I shall see the workshop with its song and chatter, chimneys, spires. Here, Baudelaire is not just referring to the necessary coexistence of ancient religion and new industry, or the absolute power of individual consciousness, but describing a very particular and modern form of solitude. The spelling out of a position, a posture, an attitude in the most physical and commonplace sense of the term, comes at the end of a movement that empties the landscape, and the gaze, of which it is the object, of all content and all meaning, precisely because the gaze dissolves into the landscape and becomes the object of a secondary, unattributable gaze, the same one or another. In my opinion, these shifts of gaze and plays of imagery, this emptying of the consciousness, can be caused, this time in systematic, generalized, and prosaic fashion, by the characteristic features of what I have proposed to call supermodernity. These subject the individual consciousness to entirely new experiences and ordeals of solitude, directly linked with the appearance and proliferation of non-places. But before going on to examine the non-places of supermodernity in detail, it may be useful to mention, albeit elusively, the attitudes displayed by the most recognized representatives of artistic modernity in relation to the notions of place and space. We know that Benjamin's interest in Parisian passages, and more generally, in iron and glass architecture, stems partly from the fact that he sees these things as embodying a wish to prefigure the architecture of the next century, as a dream or anticipation. By the same token, we may wonder whether yesterday's representatives of modernity, who found material for reflection in the world's concrete space, might not have illuminated in advance certain aspects of today's supermodernity, not through the accident of a few lucky intuitions, but because they already embodied, in an exceptional way, because they were artists, situations, postures, attitudes, which, in more prosaic form, have now become the common lot. Clearly, the word non-place designates two complementary but distinct realities: spaces formed in relation to certain ends, transport, transit, commerce, leisure, and the relations that individuals have with these spaces. Although the two sets of relations overlap to a large extent, and in any case officially, individuals travel, make purchases, relax, they are still not confused with one another. For non-places mediate a whole mass of relations, with the self and with others, which are only indirectly connected with their purposes. As anthropological places create the organically social, so non-places create solitary contractuality. Try to imagine a Durkheimian analysis of a transit lounge at Roissy